Hey guys, this is Chaz Eyre. I am a standard player for Team ABU here, and I'm here to talk to you today about Black-Red Midrange, or Chainwhirler aggro, however you would like to call it. I've been playing this deck now for about 6 months, I'd say. I came back to standard right before Dominaria, played Mardu vehicles, then I played Green-Red monsters, and then I settled on this deck. What I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to walk you through the mana base, then we're going to talk about kind of our creature and threat package, then we're going to talk about the removal package and the sideboard. First thing I want to start off with is we need to be playing 25 lands in this deck. The reason is we have a lot of 4-drops that are really key. Our 4 mana slot is kind of where we live and die, so it's essential that we hit 4 mana. So much so that I don't think you can keep a 2-land hand on the play. I think it's debatable on the drop, but first thing you need to know when you pick up this deck is that 1, you need to be playing 25 lands, 2, you need to be able to map out the game to how you get to 4 mana. The way we're going to do this is our 25 lands is going to include 8 of the black-red dual lands. That's going to be Canyon Slough that comes into play tapped in cycles and Dragonskull. We play 1 Aether Hub and 1 Swamp, and then 15 mountains. Real quick on the mountains, there's been some talk on Twitter regarding whether or not one of those mountains should become a second Aether Hub. I've tried this for 1 tournament, and it was a disaster. The reason being is because having triple red for Chainwhirler is essential, and it is possible to draw a hand of 1 basic, whether it's mountain or swamp, and the 2 Aether Hubs, and then your turn 3 is a choice between Disintegration and Chainwhirler, and when you use that energy, you've locked yourself out of one or the either. By structuring the deck so that can't happen with only 1 Aether Hub, I think is better than the potential flexibility of the second Aether Hub. So we just prevent that from ever happening by having the basic. At worst, you're not able to activate a Scrapheap trigger or the second part of Cut to Ribbons if you need it. I don't think that is as bad as potentially getting cut out of red. So that's the mana base. Really need to hit the 25 lands. Again, you can work with the second Aether Hub if you'd like to, especially if you're looking at stuff like Vraska's Contempt. I did not decide that was a great route to go. I don't think double black is something you can count on. So we're going to go ahead and move into the threat package. I'm going to do this kind of on curve. One big part of playing any aggro deck, especially a mid-range aggro deck, is you need to be able to see how you're going to win by what turn and what creatures are going to get you there. So when you pick up your first hand of 7, we've built the deck in a way so that the 1 and 2 drops can apply enough pressure to get you to those cash money 4 drops and above. So the first thing is the 4 Bomat Couriers. There has been some discussion, you've seen some Cinder Barons lists that say run more of the Vraska's Contempt heavier stuff and cut Bomat Couriers. I think this is purely wrong. Bomat Courier is too strong against a control deck. So blue-black, Esper, blue-white, there's not a better turn 1 play than Bomat Courier. 1, you're putting pressure on the board. 2, it's a time bomb of card advantage. So in a world where they don't answer it, you're essentially drawing free cards, and it's going to end up being 1 to 4 damage. So a full play set of Bomat Couriers, do be ready to side those out when you play against the mirror match, and anything else that blocks, like the mono green deck. I personally ended up settling on 1 Soul-Scar Mage. This list is very similar to what Martin Juza played at the Pro Tour 25th anniversary. The reason I went with 1 Soul-Scar Mage is with 5 1-drops, I'm looking at a 1-drop 1 in every 12 cards. So realistically, most game 1s, I feel comfortable that I'm going to have a 1-drop, which is the strongest way you can start with a deck like this. That being said, we don't have the spell support to count on prowess to make Soul-Scar necessarily a heavy threat. So I think 1's the right number. I also was not anticipating a lot of other Hazorets in the format, at least game 1s, and from other black-red decks in general. So the 1 Soul-Scar Mage still gives us an answer to Hazoret, still enables some of the Chainwhirler synergy there, but again, we're not committing ourselves to something that relies on prowess when we don't have a whole lot of ways to trigger that. So we end up with 5 1-drops. Our 2 slot in terms of threats is kind of heavy. We're running 8 total cards. 4 is going to be the best standard card that's been out for 2 years, which is Scrapheap Scrounger. This card's impact on standard has really been underestimated. It's not so much that it's colorless, and it's not so much that it's colorless, right? A lot of people think that the best part of Scrapheap Scrounger is that it's a 3-2 for 2, and that's definitely the case. It's also the ability to come back from a board wipe, and also gives you some insurance against Fumigate. which was the best removal for, best board wipe for a little bit there. Scrapheap is also essential to our other 2-drop, which is Heart of Kiran. I am only running 2 Heart of Kirans. The reason for this is I think at 3, you start to run into issues where you can't reliably crew it or have a solid curve or a mana efficient curve with 3, and getting multiples of Heart feels really bad. As much as you can expect it to be killed, there's nothing worse than being stuck with a Heart in your hand. For that reason, with just the legendaries in general, I've kind of tuned down my numbers, so this is why I'm running 2 Hearts and 2 Kari Zevs. I think it's realistic to expect that you only draw 1 of your legendaries, so you're not holding a dead card. But they also fuel each other and are good in the same matchups, right? So I'm going to be playing the Kari Zev on turn 2 against my blue-black and my blue-white decks to put pressure on immediately, whereas Heart is a bit better on turn 2 against the green decks or the other red decks because that 4 toughness is hard to deal with. And something like Flame of Keld is not running a Abrade main deck, so you can kind of get away with Heart of Kiran for a turn or 2 and really get you out to your more powerful drops where you'll start coming ahead of that deck. So that 2-drop package is really key because this is how you're going to beat the control decks. You can't keep a hand without a 1 or 2-drop, preferably 1 of each in those matchups, but I can almost guarantee you that there's not a hand without 1 of these 2-drops in it that you can count on winning the game against control. Maybe if you have an absurd amount of Bomat Couriers or something like that, you can do it, but you need that turn 2 Scrapheap or turn 2 Heart really against the control decks to be able to have a fast enough clock. Real quick, the other thing I wanted to point out about Scrapheap Scrounger in terms of how powerful this card is it also gives you some end game resiliency, I would say, where you need to go wide because these blue-black or these blue-white decks have started establishing a board you can't punch through. Particularly blue-black when you're dealing with a Scarab God, sometimes that Scrapheap Scrounger body just allows you to go wide enough that you can clear in for a couple last points before Ribbons or Glorybringer or something else can end the game for you. Always be watching out for whether or not it's better to play a fresh creature than activating a Scrapheap. And don't forget, you can always kill your own Scrapheap in response to stuff like Settle the Wreckage and Vraska's Contempt. That will allow you to, 1, not only stop the exile, but 2, you can prevent the life gain from Vraska's or something like Fumigate. So just keep in mind in those control matchups that your Scrapheap allows your dead removal cards to actually become an answer or mitigate the risk of these board wipes and answers that they have for you. So even if your removal is not good against them, it's still good for you. So just keep in mind that you want to have a Scrapheap in the graveyard. It can also pull you out some games and matchups that you may not see a lot, might not be tier 1, but are still around. For example, I've been playing against some mill decks lately. Obviously, Scrapheap Scrounger is fantastic to have milled in the yard, right? So that's kind of where our pressure is going to come from our 2-drops. Moving on to the 3-drops, we're playing 6 creatures here. I divert from a few lists here because I am playing 2 Pia Nalaars. The reason for this is I don't think there's a creature better than, say, Goblin Chainwhirler, which we're already on a playset of, than Pia Nalaar in the red decks. Because it's 2 separate bodies, it's a little bit more resilient to a single burn spell. It also gives you some insurance against things like Crop Crasher, where Goblin Chainwhirler wouldn't. So in worlds where the red decks are on the play and they are curving out on you, your turn 3 Chainwhirler is very bad in a world where they have Crop Crusher, whereas Pia Nalaar will still enable a blocker. So even if they stop Pia herself from blocking to trade with Crasher, you can usually pick off like a Pyromancer or an Earthshaker Kenra with the token, right? So, and still have the body left behind. And at some point they have to deal with Pia because you're running 10 artifact creatures, 8 of which are just straight creatures and 1 of which you can crew a vehicle, the Heart. The fire breathing that Pia gives you can also allow you to turn the table, and sacrificing an artifact to make something not block can make their Chainwhirlers useless, and can also stop their, say, Phoenixes or Hazorets from really stopping you from pushing in that damage. Real quick, another really cool interaction with Pia and your Scrapheaps is you can, say, play a Scrapheap on the board with Summoning Sickness, use it to crew Heart, sack it to Pia Nalaar to make something not block, and then return the Scrapheap and sack it again to make something else not block. Black-Red doesn't have a whole lot of card advantage sources historically, and particularly now in this deck, so finding ways that you can use cards to do more than one thing or recycle them in a way is really important to winning some of those closer games. So going up the curve, We're still gonna just lightly touch on Goblin Chainwhirler. I feel like it's very self-explanatory why he's a 4 of. There aren't a whole lot of tricks there. Again, we're only running the one Soul-Scar Mage, so minusing the team is not gonna be a game plan. One thing I have noticed with Goblin Chainwhirler is he is very bad in these blue-black or blue-white X control decks that are running around. So be willing to sideboard him out. Just because the format has kind of changed to a Chainwhirler versus Teferi world, don't be afraid to cut your keystone card. Goblin Chainwhirler is not good in these matchups, and in fact, I would always look at cutting Chainwhirler in these matchups before I even say cut possibly some removal spells. Reason being is he has no real impact coming into play. Any of the planeswalkers that these control decks are playing, including Turbofogs, Nissas, and Karns, the Chainwhirler is not necessarily killing and is not establishing any pressure off the bat, just feeds into Fumigate to really kind of come out even, and the lack of haste just makes it really underwhelming. So Chainwhirler, while it's so key to your deck because it also allows you to do the curve of Heart into Chainwhirler to possibly remove something and fly for 4, that scenario never happens against these control decks. So just know that even though your deck's built around a card, that card can and should be sided out sometime. Blue-white is definitely that matchup that you always, I think, sideboard Chainwhirler out. Blue-black is a little trickier because of things like Champion of Wits, Glint Sleeve Siphoner, which should be coming out game 2, but some folks don't. So just be aware of that there's a very good chance that if you saw an island, you should be cutting X amount of Chainwhirlers. That should almost always be 4. Going on to our 4 drops, this is kind of where most of the discussion I found for high-end aggro players happens with this deck in terms of how you split your threats. What I decided to do for the RPTQ is really count on there being a high amount of other black-red decks and other red decks. So once I made the call that that was what the metagame was going to be, and turned out that's what it was, then I have to decide what are the best cards in those matchups. When it comes to the red mirror matches, the best card in that matchup is going to be Rekindling Phoenix. This used to be a strictly sideboard card. I have moved to 3 in the main and only in the main, and have not turned back since. Rekindling Phoenix blocks Hazoret more cleanly than anything else, because even though you don't necessarily trade with Hazoret, with Rekindling Phoenix, what you are able to do is you are able to block an on-curve Hazoret with a Rekindling Phoenix, with a profit, I should say. So what happens is they curve out on turn 4 on the play with their Hazoret and empty hand. You respond with your turn 4 Rekindling Phoenix. In a world where they've emptied their hand, they're now put onto 1 card off the top to kill the Rekindling Phoenix token. And if you block the Hazoret and stop the damage, you're untapping with a hasty Phoenix and cracking back for 4. So now they have a tapped Hazoret, they did not connect for 5, and you just connected back for 4, and you can leave somebody else to block their Hazoret. So Rekindling Phoenix is a built-in way to turn that match around in the red mirror. The other big 4-drop that we're having is Chandra and Hazoret. I did decide in the black-red deck that 1 Hazoret in the main deck, and in fact the entire 75 is the right way to go. The reason being is the black-red deck, unlike the mostly red, which only splashes black for Scrapheap, or the Flame of Kel deck, which runs a turn or 2 lower on the curve, is that black-red is going to be holding some cards. You can't necessarily drop 2 or 3 cards a turn consistently throughout the game, so it's much harder to count on being able to attack with Hazoret. That being said, Hazoret is just one of the best red creatures that's ever been made. The fact that he's indestructible makes him really hard to deal with, and the built-in ability to always turn a dead card or a land into 2 damage is huge. So I don't ever want to be without Hazoret, but I also don't want to be held liable with Hazoret. So in a world where we're running 3 Phoenixes and all of these 3 drops, and we are also running 3 Chandras, we really can't afford to have more Hazorets because we can't reliably be attacking with him on turn 4 and even turn 5. So the 1 Hazoret's there, it blocks other Hazorets, it also allows us a way to punch through stuff like Steel Leaf, and it's a great way to kind of curve into the blue-white decks. So I think 1's the right number if you're playing black-red. If you're playing another red deck, you should play as many Hazorets as you possibly can justify because it's that good. It's just not that good in this deck anymore. So instead of the Hazoret, so now I'm at 3 Phoenixes and 1 Hazoret, we have 5 more big guys. And those are going to come in the form of Chandra, Torch of Defiance, and Glorybringer. I want to focus on Chandra, Torch of Defiance for a while because this card's been a staple for red in Standard for a few years, and I think it's going to have some long-term implications. She's a Planeswalker with 4 abilities. I could really just leave it at that, but a lot of what makes this deck tick is its efficiency and its consistency, and Chandra helps with both of those. So in a world where you have an explosive hand, Chandra's plus up for mana can put out another Scrap Heap, a Kari Zev, or cast a removal spell that you need, while still giving you virtual card advantage by having a high counter Planeswalker. Having a Chandra come out, ticking up to drop a Scrap Heap and passing with 5 counters on Chandra really puts the pressure on your opponent to have the answer and to proactively deal with Chandra. The other thing about Chandra that's great is she is fantastic with against these blue-white and blue-black control decks, because if they don't have their Cast Out or Vraska's Contempt, you are doing 2 damage a turn while you're also looking at a card per turn. You're running 25 lands, so there's a lot to filter there, so you are going to hit more lands than you would expect in an aggro deck. Turning those extra lands into 2 damage and taking them off the top for a potential draw is huge. You don't have a lot of ways to actually draw cards, so this is the closest as you get to a scry effect. The fact that it does 2 damage in the interim is just awesome. It's gravy on top. The -3 of Chandra is gigantic right now. -3 on Chandra gives us good game not only in, say, mirror matches, where we need to kill opponents' Chainwhirlers or even opponents' Pias and Glorybringers, but it gives us a better game against the mono green deck and the mono blue storm deck. The popularity of size since the release of M19 really kind of put a pressure on the red decks to be ready for the wide Thopter strategy. And there are plenty of games that I've played where Chandra was my only answer to Sai, but it was the best answer to Sai. So being able to, say, drop something like Pia Nalaar into Chandra to minus and kill Sai really gives you, your 5th turn is very powerful, because not only are we looking at a potential Glorybringer or Phoenix, but you also are going to get 2 chances to find either one of those through your draw and the tick up of Chandra, and you're doing damage on the side. So I moved to 3 Chandras rather than, say, 2 Hazorets, because that minus is huge, and I would rather proactively kind of kill the big threats in the mono blue storm deck and just apply steady pressure than I would hope that they don't combo out. This is also true when I'm playing the mono green matchup. That deck in general feels like they're just goldfishing for the Steel Leaf Champion draw, and whatever turn that comes out is really not the issue. Obviously, their turn 2 Steel Leaf off of Llanowar is really hard to deal with, but even if they get in for 10, being able to drop a Chandra, kill the Steel Leaf, leave a counter up, and have a chance to recover can be enough. If they don't have the Ronis or Gulta, you're still in that game. And because of this reason, and because of the versatility that Chandra has in a lot of matchups, the only matchup she's a poor card or a liability in are the other red decks. But again, because they're running their own Chainwhirlers and Glorybringers, she's not the worst 4-drop to have, and I can't really justify or see room for the 4th Phoenix in that case, so I think a 3-3 split of the Phoenixes is really the right way to go, knowing that your main targets are Glorybringers, Sais, Steel Leaf Champions. Lastly, at the very end of our curve are 2 Glorybringers. Traditionally, these lists were running 1. I moved to 2 because I found against the control decks and the green decks that Glorybringer was sometimes my only way to recover and to gain parity in the match. So by dropping a Glorybringer on turn 5 and being able to kill a Sai, a Steel Leaf Champion, a Goblin Chainwhirler for 4 damage and profit, usually gives you the extra turn or 2 you need to either poke in with whatever board you've established, or to just go over the top. Also, don't forget you don't have to exert Glorybringer, so there are plenty of times where it's just right to drop the 4/4 Flying Haste and just get in for 4. The amount of flyers in the format is pretty minimal. We're really only looking at Thopters and other red decks Thopters. So when you're thinking about Glorybringer, just keep in mind that it's not only good because it's a 2-for-1 by doing damage and killing a creature, it's good because you don't have to exert it, so you can just come in for 4, and if you pass the turn to them with a Phoenix and Glorybringer on the board, and Glorybringer is not exerted, if they only have the 1 removal spell, say Vraska's Contempt, or even Doomfall, it really gets hard for them to make that decision on which one's the right one to kill. And if there is an unexerted Glorybringer on the board, any creature they play is a liability, even if it's bigger. So kind of keep this in mind for like Gear Hulk, for example. Sometimes it's right to exert your Glorybringer to put the 4 damage on Gear Hulk to deter them from blocking something like, say, Scrapheap Scrounger or a Ragged Van token. So don't be afraid to declare your attack, exert onto a Gear Hulk that's already on the board, because this will set up an awkward block for them. So now your opponent has to make the decision of, instead of blocking this token for free, do I lose my Gear Hulk or do I allow the extra 2 to go through? If you've been establishing pressure through on turns 1 through 3, like you should be, and like the deck is designed to do, that's a solid place to be, because even though you're going to be lower on cards than them and your cards are generally less powerful than these blue control decks, you've now taken over the driver's seat in the sense of you're almost forcing them to declare blockers how you want to. And as an opponent, if I see somebody attacking with a Glorybringer and exert it, and I don't have to block, I'm wondering what the next corner looks like, what's around the corner for me, because it can't be good. Lastly, I want to talk about the removal package. One thing that you'll notice is I'm not playing any Magma Sprays, Shocks, or Lightning Strikes in the main deck. This is one of the biggest differences with the black-red mid-range deck, if you will, versus the mostly red or Flame of Keld aggro decks, is we don't really have a great way to go face, which is why the pressure from the creatures is so important in the early game. But the removal we are running allows us to kind of retake games that may slip out of other red decks' hands. So I know I've already talked about Steel Leaf Champion a lot and Sai a lot. These are, I think, very powerful 1.5 tier 1 decks that are out there, but I think having built-in answers to those creatures helps your matchup a lot, just knowing you have those. So with those 2 cards being around the edge of the format, that helped bring me to the decision of 2 Glorybringers, but also 2 cuts. The cuts are also good in the mirror match, but they kill these very important creatures these other decks are running with little drawbacks. So even against, say, control decks, a cut to ribbons is going to be much more effective than, say, a Magma Spray, because at least you can do some face damage with it. It's not quite as good as, say, a Lightning Strike against, say, blue-white approach, because you legitimately have no targets, but that modularity, that ability to have both modes, gives you a flexibility that the other aggro decks don't. And when the other aggro decks see a Steel Leaf Champion or a Sai, they have to 2-for-1 themselves to deal with it, whereas you don't. You're actually getting a 2-for-1 because you're cutting their creature and you have a ribbons in the graveyard. I can't tell you how many games I've won because I will untap, go for a lethal ribbons, they're forced to disallow it, and now they're off their Settle the Wreckage mana. So now I get to pump in for either lethal or almost lethal. So I really like 2 cut to ribbons. I'm also running 2 unlicensed disintegration, really for the same reason. I need a way to be able to kill those bigger creatures. It's also not terrible in the blue-black matchup when you're killing a Scarab God. Even though you know the Scarab God's going to be coming back to the hand, that 3 damage to their face and not a blocker on the board can be the difference. So kind of accept in those matchups when a Scarab God comes down on the board, there's not going to be a whole lot you can do to retake that game over, but if you can take a blocker away while you lightning bolt their face, that seems worth 2 slots in the main deck to me. This is also our only answer to Ghalta. I think the green deck is positioned really well against the black-red deck. Disintegration is really our only way to deal with Ghalta. Any other card in our deck really can't do enough, and we're really looking on almost a 3-for-1 investment other than Disintegration to kill Ghalta. So I found that it was very important to have it. It's a great answer to Torrential Gear Hulk, Lyra, these other big creatures that you might not be seeing a lot of consistently, but I never want to be in a position where I see a creature and I know that my main board has no way to deal with it, so that's why I ended up on the 2 Disintegrations. Lastly, I ended at 3 Abrades. There are none of these in the sideboard. The reason is, again, the flexibility. With the advent of the Mono Blue Storm deck, I thought that I had to have more than 2 Abrades, and I thought that 4 may have been the right spot for a while because of, say, the Soul-Scar prowess or the ability to kill other weird artifacts out there. Mainly, what ended up happening after testing was I was really only killing Inspiring Statuaries and Heart of Kirans, and then doing 3 damage. I think that flexibility in the blue matchup is necessary, and in fact, it's not a bad matchup for the black-red deck. So 3 really gives you just the right amount of kill-a-do to allow your Bomat to keep stacking cards against, say, blue-black when they have something like Champion of Wits or Gifted Aetherborn. It also gives you an answer to all these knights that are running around, and abrading a mana dork is never a terrible thing. I mean, obviously, you don't want to always have to abrade a Llanowar elf, but abrading a Servant of the Conduit is not bad at all, especially on the play. If you have a turn 1 Bomat, and they go nothing on turn 1, turn 2 Servant, turn 3 Abrade, and nothing else is just fine, especially if you're stacking cards. So the 7 removal spells gives us just enough that we can probably count on seeing 1 per game. I include Chandra in this kind of suite of removal spells because she hits for 4, which is really kind of the sweet spot for a lot of creatures right now. The smaller red decks have an issue with these 4 toughness creatures, whereas the black-red deck does not. So if we really kind of look at how we can kill 4 toughness creatures, we have 7 ways, and I think that's great. I think that's exactly where we want to be to just kind of give us an edge against these mono blue and green decks that we know are out and about. Now I do want to move on over to the sideboard. So the sideboard that I decided to play from RPTQ was crafted through really just a lot of playtesting. I've been playing 2 to 3 standard tournaments a week for the last 2.5 months since Grand Prix Vegas. And what I saw and what I decided was that this RPTQ was going to have a lot of red decks, and that Turbo Fog would be prevalent because there was such a high expectation of mono red. So what I expected, because so many players qualified playing limited, that these folks would pick up low cost, straightforward linear decks to play in these RPTQs, which turned out to be the Flame of Kel deck, but that there would be another subset of players that would feel that that would be the metagame, and they would bring Turbo Fog or some type of Esper or blue-white control. This turned out 100% to be the case, and I think I nailed 14 out of my 15 sideboard cards. First thing I want to talk about is the red removal package. So what we're working with is 2 Magma Sprays, 3 Chandra's Defeat. These are 1 mana removal spells, so when we're playing against other red decks, we're always going to side out our Bomat Couriers. This means our turn 1 is very uninvolved. We only have 1 Soul-Scar Mage in the main deck, so we are not doing anything on turn 1 in game 2 or 3 against these other red decks. So I wanted to make sure that I had more than 4 1-mana removal spells, so that end of turn on turn 1, I could clear the way for my Scrapheap or my Kari Zev. So I ended up with 3 Chandras, 2 Magma Sprays. The Magma Sprays kill mana dorks in the green matchup. They also exile Scrapheap Scrounger, which is huge. In the mirror match, a lot of the times you will 1-for-1 or kind of grind out each other's big guys, and then it's a matter of going wide with stuff like Scrapheap Scrounger and Pia Nalaar and your Chainwhirlers. Magma Spray puts them down a Scrapheap to recur, which makes it harder for them to go wide. So that really enables your cards like Rekindling Phoenix that shine in those matchups to just be better, because if you can keep Scrapheap from recurring, your good blocking creatures like Phoenix just get better. I don't think more than 2 is appropriate because it can just be a dead card. If they play something that's bigger than 2 toughness, it feels really weird holding a Magma Spray, which is why I went with 3 Chandra's Defeats instead. I'm bringing these in the same matchups almost every time. Magma Spray may be sometimes against blue-black, but I'm not convinced on that yet, just because of Champion of Wits. But the 3 Chandra's Defeats are key because it kills Chandra, and I'm finding more and more Flame of Kel players are bringing in Chandras as a way to try to match power level with the black-red decks. Obviously, from the name, there's not a better answer to Chandra than Chandra's Defeat. So we play 3 of those. It also gives us a clean answer to Glorybringer, Rekindling Phoenix, and if we're so lucky to have our 1 Soul-Scar Mage, it's a great 2-mana answer to Hazoret. So the discard ability won't really come up often, but I'll tell you when it does, it's great to be able to filter. There's nothing better than discarding a Scrapheap Scrounger to Chandra's Defeat. It's pure value, it's clean, it's efficient, and the other cool thing that I want to point out about Chandra's Defeat is it can kill a Chandra after she's ticked up, and I can't underestimate how important that is. And by highlighting that, I also want to highlight how important it is that you kill the Chandra as soon as you see it. You can't let them get to 6 counters because you'll have to 2-for-1 yourself to kill it, or at least waste an attacker. So just kind of keep in mind that they're going to get their Chandra, they're going to get their tick up, but it is almost always right to hold your Chandra's defeat until at least turn 4, so you can see if something like Chandra, Phoenix, Hazoret is coming down and you can deal with it. Just don't be that guy that Chandra's defeats like Pyromancer or even like Soul-Scar Mage. Sometimes you'll have to, but just keep in mind that you want to try to hold that as late as you can. So for the control decks and these Turbo Fog decks that I anticipated would be showing up a lot, I brought a kind of interesting package of what I thought was hand removal on top of pressure. So I played 4 Duress and 1 Doomfall. Looking at their hand, what you're really looking to take from the Turbo Fog players particularly is Gift of Paradise. It is the best card in their deck and they don't know it. The reason is it's giving them 3 life, but it also is what enables them to curve aggressively. So their ideal hand goes turn 3 Gift of Paradise, turn 4 Teferi, turn 5 turn 5 untap. Duressing for that Gift of Paradise by keeping that 3 life from them can keep you in the clock before they start chaining their Nexus of Fate. So it's very important that that's what you're looking for with Duress. The next card that you're usually going to be looking for is going to be Settle the Wreckage. I do want to point out that a common mistake I see other people make playing this deck is that our Duress is not best on turn 1. So Duress is best on turn 3 in this deck. The reason is we want to establish pressure with creatures on turns 1 and 2. My ideal Duress against these decks, on the play of course because I'm aiming for Gift of Paradise, is I would love a turn 1 drop, a turn 2 drop, and on turn 3 a Duress and a 2 drop. I think that's the strongest position to be in at the end of that turn against that deck. It also makes sure that you can see the 2 cards they've drawn since the game started. So it's always tempting to get a look at what they're dealing with right off the bat. What's important to know when you're playing aggro is you dictate the speed of the match, and you know that there is very little that they can and will do between turns 1 and 2. So the worst case scenario against Turbo Fog of not duressing before your 2-drop is that you get something sealed away, like a Scrapheap Scrounger. I believe that risk is worth it for the higher chance of one of the 2 cards that they've drawn since the game started being Settle the Wreckage or Fumigate or Teferi or something that powerful. The 1 Doomfall, this is kind of our insurance answer for Scarab God, other people's Hazorets, and also a way to just exile cards out of the hand. I used to play more than 1. I think 1 is just fine. The way I look at it is it's 5 discard spells, so I'm going to see 1 out of every 12 cards. I should be able to expect 1 a game. Also, a late game Duress is not as bad off the top in this deck because we have so many 4 and 5 drops. So if you get that Duress late in the game, it's important to not think that it's bad. It's important to look at the threats in your hand and think of Duress as almost a proactive counterspell and how you can clear the way. Duress also works very well with Hazoret and Chandra because of its low mana cost, so it slides into a lot of turns that other things wouldn't, particularly your removal spells that you probably cited out for these. So those are 2 mana spells in game 1. Duress is a 1 mana spell. What that means is a lot of the times you can disrupt their hand and develop a threat. The next card that I had for the Turbo Fog matchup, and almost purely for the Turbo Fog matchup, it kind of comes in against blue-white once in a while, is Insult to Injury. I did toy around with the idea of Glorious End as an idea to handle these Nexus of Fate decks, but I wasn't convinced that I would have enough pressure, especially siding out Goblin Chainwhirlers, that I would be able to reliably kill them in 1 turn, whereas the double damage from Insult almost always kills them. You also have enough haste creatures that you can kind of sneak by some hidden damage with stuff like Bomat Courier and Glorybringer and Hazoret activations. So the 2 Insult to Injuries are purely for Turbo Fog. They've been great when I've played against Turbo Fog. That being said, keep in mind they still have Settle the Wreckage, so it's not always game over when you have lethal with Insult. You still need to attack pretty strategically. So just keep in mind that just because you Insult to Injury, you're not safe yet. Just because you stop the Fog doesn't mean you stop the Settle. Going to my sideboard, the last 3 cards are all 1-ofs, and the only change I would make has to do with these 1-ofs. So I played 1 Banefire, 1 Glorybringer, and 1 Angrath. The Banefire was really targeted at these blue-white control decks running 3 or more settles. I wanted a way to be able to punish them for giving me too much mana. I also wanted a way that I could play a damage spell without them being able to counter it. Because Disallow is so prevalent, they are forced to counter a lot of spells earlier than Banefire, I should say. So things like Chandra, Hazoret, Glorybringer have to be dealt with. While they're using their counter spells or spot removal to deal with those creatures, you're setting up for a gigantic Banefire. In this deck, you usually don't need that Banefire to be more than 7 or so. So 1 Settle the Wreckage usually gets you there. Keep in mind we're playing 25 lands in the main deck because 4 mana is so important to us. It's not unrealistic to get 3 to 5 lands depending on if you have Kari's Ev or not because of the token from Settle the Wreckage. So I ran 1 Banefire and I would stand by that. I also ran 1 Glorybringer for the same reasons we talked about our removal package and our Chandra Glorybringer package earlier. It's really good against the green decks. It's another way to interact with the mono blue storm deck by killing Psy, flying over, eating Thopters one at a time. But it's also a hasty creature with a decent body, so it's good against some of these control decks. So sometimes against those control decks, what I found myself doing a lot lately is I will cut 4 Chainwhirlers, 2 Cuts, 2 Abrades, and 1 Disintegration, and then put in some combination of the discard spells Banefire, sometimes even 1 Insult to Injury because it's really unexpected. So if you see something like a tap out for Scarab God or something like that, sometimes you can just slide in with 1 of your insults. I only think 1 insult is good against the control decks, but just keep in mind that your sideboard card that was designed for 1 matchup does have some utility in other slower matchups. You're doubling all of the damage you're dealing on the board and out of your hand. The last card, and this is the card that I would change, is Angrath the Flame Chained. Now, the reason I didn't change him is because he was amazing the week before I went to RPTQ, and that was the first week I got to play with him. He is fantastic against these control decks because any card advantage that they are getting, and it's virtual card advantage off of Search for Azcanta because they're not necessarily drawing extra cards. What they're doing is they're drawing better quality cards. Angrath's Plus really gives you a way to mitigate that because now they can't just sit and hold their hand. They are pressured to at least play something every turn or miss a land drop every turn. And as anybody who's played against control knows, the land drops and the pure advantage that they get from having more powerful spells and being able to establish a board is really what does you in. If you can keep their hand low and then punish them, it's the same 2 damage that Chandra's Plus does. Angrath goes really far. Now, I was really impressed initially with Angrath's minus ability and say things like the Mirror Match and being able to take creatures and kill them. So taking an opponent's Chainwhirler, attacking with them, and having the Chainwhirler died was really powerful for me in my testing. What I've evolved on, and this is from a conversation I watched on Twitter involving Arilax and a quote from Sam Black, is that Karn Scion of Urza is better than Angrath. And I do think that this is true and would be the only change I made to my RPTQ deck. The reason is in the red mirror matches, whether it's Flame of Keld, mostly red, or the black-red mid-range deck that I'm playing myself, the card advantage engines are hard to come by, and really the only one we have is Chandra. But we know that we and our opponents are probably citing in Chandra's defeat. So our Chandras need to come out in that matchup because it's such a liability to pay 4 mana for 2 damage to have our Planeswalker die to a 1 mana removal spell. Karn gets around this by being a colorless Planeswalker. He is also very strong against the Flame of Keld deck because he makes these constructs that are at minimum 1/1, which most of their guys have 1 toughness. But we're also running 10 artifacts in the main deck. So it's not unreasonable to think that our constructs can be 3/3s by turn 4, and the sheer amount of loyalty counters he comes in with is very strong. I haven't actually gotten the chance to play through with him and see this work in action in a tournament setting, but all of the playtesting I've done with him on the side, the sequence goes turn 1, Bomat, turn 2, 2-drop, turn 3, some type of removal, turn 4, Karn, make a 2/2 to 3/3 depending on if you had Heart or Scrapheap or not, and then you start drawing cards, and you're drawing a whole extra card turn with Karn. And the mono red decks don't have a way to deal with this other than their burn. So unless they can lightning strike him at 3, you're going to get a 2-for-1 out of him anyway. And don't forget, you still have the token behind. So in short, change your Angrath to a Karn. It dodges Chandra's defeat. The Angrath is definitely better against a blue X control deck, so you may be able to find room for keeping him. I think in my list, if you were to do that, you can cut the 4th Duress or possibly the Banefire and play 1 Karn, 1 Angrath. Well, there you have it. That's my rundown from what I've learned about the black-red mid-range deck over the last 3 months. What I hope you get from this is not only how to kind of play with it, but also against it, and kind of give you an insight into what decisions not only you should be making when you're playing against this deck, but what decisions the black-red and the red players are making while you're playing them. And hopefully this translates into some round win results for you. And I look forward to seeing you guys all at the next FNM or Standard Showdown.